at our school, because there's a lot of other people. I think Alan and I might disagree about some things about this, but it's interesting to note that this is a movie which is extremely violent, and it raises the issue of fighting back. And as I was watching all of the violence, I tried to relate it to two books on the Civil War. One by Robert Fogel, Without Consent or Contract, and the recent book, which I think is wonderful, by Bruce Levine. And they both make the point, which is why we should be studying the Civil War here, that you couldn't have gotten rid of slavery without a war. And thus the movie itself is advancing a position about violence, not one very popular in our school, but certainly, and I'm not making a judgment on this, ought to be part of a curriculum of a school like this. Obviously, I'm very pro-history, and I don't like what's happened to history in the school. But by looking at these arguments about the Civil War in light of Django and recent scholarship, you in effect have to make a choice. Violence, right? War, 600,000 dead bodies, or slavery, nothing in between. And that's fascinating. I'm raising it as an intellectual issue based on what needs to be examined here and why simply studying the history of the American Civil War would be very important for students at our school. Okay? Do you have anything? I know we have academics become more at 4. Want to have that one? I know you have a course called actually, including Alan.
There are some questions
on the subject. Let's do the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Go ahead.
I had sort of two dominant thoughts, not only listening to this, but after seeing it on Saturday. And I'm not sure if these two thoughts will weave together or not, but the first is on Stephen himself. As you see the last scene, as he's just about to be blown up, I almost wanted, the simple answer is that here is the answer that you gave, Art, is that here's a man who climbed through the system to get near the top and was basically an ass kisser, but it seemed worse to me than that. He seemed to be an even more despicable creature than just that would allow for. And so, at the risk of making the movie 10 minutes longer, I would have liked to have seen some sort of discussion before he gets blown up, of course, because I really didn't, one can't be terribly depressed that Stephen meets his end. But to have a few minutes there really explaining what his psychology is that makes him so attached to the system that he is so attached to. And I don't really, that seemed lacking to me, although maybe it's so obvious that it doesn't need to be there. It seems like it should have been more complex in that sense. The other question that I had was towards you, Alan, in terms of the Jefferson Candyland connection, and I think that you're absolutely right that in terms of the way slaves are treated and in terms of the rhetoric of slavery, I think that there's probably very little to no difference. But I think it would have been even more interesting had Candy been not as blatantly despicable as he was. He seemed to be, other than being the pseudo-intellectual phrenologist and his love of things French, or what, though he couldn't read the language, or understand it, that there should have been more nuance to him, and that would have been made for a much more morally interesting situation that would have highlighted the bad aspects of his character perhaps even more deeply. And those were the two of the thoughts, anyway, that I came away with that I think were reflected.
About this first question, about his psychology. What is shown in the film is that Samuel Jackson actually knows more than the master.
Right.
And he doesn't just finish the master's sentences, he's quite obviously smarter than the master. And the master would have been taken in view, except for Samuel Jackson. So one of the things about it is one should be careful about this point about lacking. Because one of the things is often the best lackeys, my student convoys, for example, manage to get themselves involved in torture or crime in a quite skillful way, which is willing to assume that the powerful guy is responsible for the bushel change. And it's very sad, but it's a real phenomenon, and it's worth taking in. And the deeper point that lies behind this is just this, that often people from oppressed backgrounds, when they get power, psychologically identify with their oppressors. So that when I talk as a Jew who has fought against Nazis all my life about Palestinians, I say, sometimes that work, that the Jews of the occupied territories, they suffer from apartheid and Jim Crow, and in the nastiest, most calculated way, they're being transferred out of Judea and Samaria in a completely hideous. I mean, if you actually talk about what's going on on the ground, I can describe to you what I saw, but let me put it this way. If I were to speak about it for an hour here, I will go to this one, just straight up in the examples, you might find it quite hard to keep lunch down. I mean, I found it very hard. And if you ask about the state of Israel, a lot of the people who are kicking them around, because they have a bunch of kids kicking them around and shooting weapons at them. But a lot of the people have identified with Europeans. They relocated them. And this is not an uncommon phenomenon. And I think that that's more dangerous in the sense that often the most atrocious people, the people who carry out the most atrocious things, you could say that Candy was willing to do anything. Right. But if you want the guy
Stephen
who
actually did it.
it's Stephen. And so it's worth it taking Stephen in as a symbol of that thing that, there were a lot of house slaves, like Brunhilde. She was a house slave, right? But she didn't end up like that. So the fact is you have a choice. You don't have to behave like that. So just as I think nuance, by the way, would be better in all things. But frankly, it wouldn't be that movie. And since we have a culture which has been so blatantly racist, that I think Romney got some very large number of votes.
Sadly.
Right. And it's not because he had a program that would actually help anybody. He had no program. His program was austerity and giving money to the rich. So, and bombing people. I mean, a more unattractive program than he had. If you just take it straight up, it would be hard. If you're writing a satire of what some right-wing politician would say, self-deportation. Oh, wait a minute. Does he think abortion is okay in the case of rape? Maybe he does. Gee whiz, he's almost a human being compared to Ryan. Gosh. So if you ask what kept that afloat and what keeps it afloat among Americans is this other tendency, which is unrelieved racism. And it's really worth taking that in. It would be nice if we had nuanced programs in politics and we had people who would genuinely work on a bipartisan basis. It actually is the case that Obama goes much too far in this direction. And if you want to see the utter decadence of our politics controlled by money, it's the fact that he can't get a deal to move the country out of depression, from people who really ought to be able to get elected while doing a few, not many, but one or two pieces.
Michael,